how is a home or real estate typically valued in a divorce case?
So like I said, you can either agree on
How do you figure out what that asset is worth, or what steps would you take as an attorney to determine that?
so typically,
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Illinois Family Law Insider. I am Katie Van Dusen, managing partner at Sterling. And today I have with me Senior Associate Jacqueline McClellan. Thanks for joining us today.
thanks, Katie. I'm happy to be here.
So today, Jacqueline, we are going to be diving into talking about how courts determine asset values in a divorce case and what steps or kind of strategies we can use to help support clients and advise them accordingly. So, whenever we have these types of assets come up in a case, the big question is, how do courts, or who decides what something is worth?
Right. Yeah. Ultimately, it's going to be the judge, but there are various means that we use throughout the divorce process to actually get those values to present to the judge.
And in your experience, Jacqueline, what assets are typically valued, or what kind of, I don't know, raises like a spidey sense as to maybe needing to value something? Is there like a list you have, or what in your experience requires that?
Yeah. If you own a home is definitely going to be a property that will likely be valued. If you can't agree, there's pensions and retirement accounts because pensions don't actually hold a value. So you have to get that value. If you have non-marital assets, specifically like retirement accounts, or if there's like contested personal property, those could also be valued.
Okay, and I heard you say, if you can reach an agreement. So is it safe to say if two parties can kind of talk through these things and reach an agreement on these things, then maybe the judge is not the one that's determining value? Maybe it's the parties. And then if the parties can't decide on that value, that's when a judge steps in and tries to determine value.
Exactly. Yeah. If the parties can reach an agreement, the judge isn't going to stand in the way, most likely.
Got it. Okay. And so kind of shifting our focus to the very first thing you mentioned, a house, a home. So majority of the cases that we see, we do have real estate involved.
Right.
So how is a home or real estate typically valued in a divorce case?
So like I said, you can either agree on the value. There's something called a comparative market analysis. You can sometimes use those, but the best way to get it valued would be an appraisal of the property.
Okay. And you said best way. What does best way mean in terms of your practice and how you approach cases?
Right. Yeah. So the judge is typically, if the case were to go to trial, okay, the judge is going to want an appraisal of the property where the realtor is actually going inside the home and checking it all out versus that comparative market analysis I discussed.
Got it. So when it comes to proof, or when it comes to maybe credibility, typically an appraisal is going to be weighted more heavily than, let's say, in comparison to a comparative market analysis. Is that safe to say?
Exactly.
Okay. And then do both sides typically agree on utilizing an appraiser, or does each side always have to get their own? How does that work?
Yeah, so that depends. I mean, the parties can agree to select one appraiser, or one side gets an appraisal. Maybe the other side doesn't agree with the value, so they decide to get their own. So it's a case by case basis. It just depends.
Got it. Okay. And have you experienced both in terms of your practice, where you have utilized someone who's mutually agreed upon, they're going to be a neutral who's valuing the property, or in the alternative, have you seen where each side is getting their own appraiser?
Yep. Yep. It just kind of depends on how contested the case is, which area you go.
That makes total sense. And then in terms of my last question, when it comes to kind of real estate or home values, what happens in a case where, let's say, you get an appraisal report and the appraised value is actually worth less than what is owed on the mortgage? When we're talking about owed on the mortgage, we're talking principal balance owed.
Right. Yeah. So in that instance, whoever, if they're going to be keeping the property, who's going to be keeping the property would probably keep that liability. If they're selling the property, then both parties are probably going to be responsible for, whatever the deficiency is.
Okay, so it almost shifts the mindset to whenever you have a mortgage that's worth more than the appraised value, that house then is almost like underwater, right? There is no equity to allocate in that instance. It's really dealing with kind of an analysis of, does either party want to keep the property or the residence that's underwater and continue to make payments? Or is it a situation where we have to sell it, or is it foreclosed upon? And then we're dealing with, how do we divvy up this liability between people, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. And then, how do you advise your clients when it comes to the differences between an agreed upon value, a comparative market analysis, and an appraisal? And do you ever kind of rely on each one of those depending on the specific case? Is it on a case by case basis? And how do you best advise people as to which is the best fit for them?
Yes, definitely a case by case basis. Like I said before, like if it's really highly litigious, we're anticipating that this could potentially go to trial. I'm absolutely going to recommend getting an appraisal.
Yep.
If the other side is agreeable or they, get along, I guess, a stipulated fair market value if they feel fairly confident on that value. I typically don't advise clients to get comparative market analysis, only because, just in case we do have to go to trial, you might as well spend your resources on the document that the judge is actually going to end up relying on.
Yep, definitely. And then one follow-up question to that. In terms of your practice, Jacqueline, have you ever gotten an appraisal report? Let's say you choose to get it early on in the case because of kind of the litigious nature of things. Do you ever find that it can then get stale, or that you almost have to update it? Or what is the impact that that could have on how, parties are negotiating settlement if it kind of gets to a point where it's so far removed, right? Like, let's say it's a 1 year old appraisal report. How could that affect things or impact things for your client?
Right. Well, markets change. They are very fluid. They go up and down. So if the market, depending on whether your client wants to keep the home or not, you may want to get another appraisal, a year later for that reason.
Definitely. I feel like that's always something that you have to touch base with the client on, and figuring out if there's one person who wants to keep the house and buy out the other. That is something that I think is pivotal to figure out early on in a case, because that then informs how you strategically take the next steps, right? And what you choose to do with the client. Or yeah, it has an effect on things for sure. And then shifting focus, something that we haven't really mentioned yet, but could be a huge asset, is a business. So when you have either a business owner or someone who comes to you who's getting a divorce from someone who owns a business, how do you figure out what that asset is worth? Or what steps would you take as an attorney to determine that?
Yeah, so typically if the value is contested, if there's, one side thinks there's a value, the other side doesn't, then you typically appoint what's called a business valuator. So they come in and value the business, all the assets that they have, that kind of thing.
Got it. And then what is the difference in your experience between someone who is appointed as, let's say, a business valuator and a forensic accountant?
Yeah. So, I mean, the business valuator is only looking at the business, their bank accounts, checking accounts, that kind of thing. A forensic accountant can look at everything. So they can look at the business assets, like let's say bank checking and savings accounts, but also the personal checkings and savings accounts to kind of trace like where's this money going.
Got it. Okay. So it might be safe to say, in terms of your practice or advising a client, if someone's really after what is this business worth, then we're leaning towards a business valuator. If the client has concerns as to maybe how the money is flowed between personal and business, or an accounting of where that money is going and how that flow works, that's where the forensic accountant would really be more valuable.
Absolutely. Yep.
Got it. Okay, good to know and good to note for sure for people. And have you ever worked on a case where personal goodwill came into play, like where a business's value dropped because it was closely tied to the owner or the person who, started the business, versus, let's say, a more of a corporate entity where maybe the owner didn't have as much direct impact on how that business operated or the value of that business?
Yes, I have. I had a case where this party owned two businesses, but the values ultimately were zero because it was all relied on personal goodwill, essentially.
Yeah. And I feel like we see that sometimes, most typically it's like, say, an attorney who owns their own practice,
Right.
or maybe a dentist who really the intrinsic value of that business is that person who is performing the service
Yep.
versus maybe a company that, sells bolts and widgets or something like that,
Right.
that's your
Own
PTSD.
property or something like that.
Okay, and then shifting our focus again to maybe one more huge issue is retirements and pensions. So, a lot of times we do see cases where two parties are getting divorced and someone owns a pension or owns a retirement account. So, how do you value those things, or how do you make it clear as to what the value is when someone's going through a divorce?
Yeah, so typically you would hire an actuary to come in to determine what that value actually would be, that cash value per se.
And I don't know about you, Jacqueline, but in my practice, I feel like actuaries are most, I think, utilized when it comes to one, a pension, right? Valuing a pension. And if you're wanting to offset that pension against something else, you really need to know the value. So the actuary can do that. Or the second kind of circumstance that I've seen a lot is determining marital and non marital percentages, right? And if someone has a significant non marital portion of a retirement account, that's when the actuary is really invaluable because they can come in, they can look at each one of those statements and figure out really in great detail as to what percentage is marital and what percentage is non-marital.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made a really good point. It's every statement. So you need that statement from, the date you were married up until present day. So that's really important if you want to value your non-marital portion of your retirement account.
Definitely. Have you ever utilized an actuary to determine, this percentage of my account was from prior to the marriage, and this percentage of my account was during the marriage? And I think one other thing people, have a tendency to forget about is if you have a premarital value, there also has been growth that's been accumulating during the course of the marriage that could be assigned as non-marital, right? Versus a marital portion. Have you ever used an actuary? And then what impact did that have on settlement negotiations for your case or trial?
Yeah, so I haven't actually used one yet, but I have threatened to use it. I said my client's willing to take this amount right now, but if we don't agree, he's going to hire an actuary. And that actually was able to facilitate the settlement in this instance.
Awesome. That's great. I have had a case where we ended up getting stock actually was
Mm.
valued, and there was a premarital portion of the stock and then a marital portion of the stock. And what
Yeah.
ended up happening is the premarital portion turned out to be like approximately $900,000. And the total stock was maybe like, I don't know, 1.2 million. So the impact that this client, spent a couple $100 to get
Mhm.
an to look at this, and the return on that was huge, and we ended up presenting that at a pretrial, and eventually if a trial occurs, we're going to be asking that actuary to testify as to their report and their findings. Something you brought up earlier in the podcast was if a case goes to trial, the attorney really needs to be thinking about how do we prove this? How do we present evidence on this? And I think it would be very rare that you would have a client who would be able to testify to those things at a level that the judge would give credit to, just because that's a very complicated analysis that goes into that. So having that actuary be available for trial, I think also just strategically puts you in the best position possible. Kind of switching gears on one final topic is forensic accountants and when and why you use them. So you already talked about why what exactly does a forensic accountant do? They look at both business and personal accounts. They see that flow of income and money going in and out. But one thing I wanted to ask is what is the difference between kind of a CPA and a forensic accountant when it comes to what they look at and how they look at things?
Yeah, so the forensic accountant is specifically trained to trace the money, right? So if maybe one spouse is not super familiar with, how their other spouse or their spouse spent money, where the money was actually going. That forensic accountant can come in to analyze kind of where the money went. Maybe it suggests like you actually need to get documents from this entity because I'm seeing several transfers into this entity and I don't have documents for that. So they can
Yep.
kind of help you analyze exactly where the money went and maybe what additional documents you need.
And then does that typically kind of go hand in hand with a marital waste claim or maybe even dissipation? If the forensic accountant is telling you, hey, there's a ton of money that is exiting from the business into these personal accounts, and then let's say business owner is spending that on either gambling or drugs or taking vacations with maybe their significant other that just came into the picture recently, do those typically go hand in hand in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be probably the main reason I would suggest hiring a forensic accountant is if we have concerns about marital waste or dissipation.
Definitely. And in your practice, Jacqueline, do you ever feel like not digging into these things early on in the case can really have a negative impact, meaning valuing assets and getting clarity as to how to value assets? Could that have a negative impact if you don't look into those things early on? And let's say you have a poorly worded settlement agreement. What's the impact that that could have on that client?
Yeah. So if you're concerned about marital waste or you're concerned about a value, doing it early is going to be best. Main reason is because it's just going to extend the timeline of the case. They do take a lot of time, but poorly worded settlement agreements can cause confusion after the fact. So if the case is finalized and it's poorly worded, maybe both sides interpret things differently, and then you're forced to go back to court to have the judge kind of decide what the language, I guess, means. So it's just an added cost.
Right. Added time and added cost, right?
Yes.
So even though maybe an appraisal might take a little bit longer, or an actuary might take a little bit longer,
Right.
it might be worth the investment on the front end versus the aftermath that could negatively impact them on the back end, right?
Absolutely.
So if someone owns complex assets or is worried about a fair division, what would be the first step you would advise them to take?
Yeah. So probably what valuation tool are we going to use? That's going to be the first analysis. Is it a retirement account? Is it a business? Like, do we need to get this business valued? That's what we're going to discuss very early on in the case.
And then what's your advice? What's your, final takeaway for a client who's trying to value, let's say, a business, a home, a pension without spending a fortune in expert fees?
So your attorney's probably going to have a lot of good resources, and you can do the research, right? You can, if I give you multiple business valuators, you can call them and ask them for, their quote for how they do things, or your attorney might actually already know kind of what that cost is going to be. And again, just if you want to do your research, you're always welcome to do your research to figure out, the cheapest option, but someone that also has a good reputation for doing what they do.
And to keep in mind that while it may seem like there is this upfront cost to kind of tap on these experts or individuals to help value things, that could actually either create a huge return or
Yeah,
have a huge impact on the outcome of the case in terms of settlement or litigation, and also avoid a huge headache further on down the line if you're not providing clarity and you don't have a meeting of the minds as to what these things are worth or what the values are, and creating additional litigation, cost, time that no one wants to do.
absolutely. Definitely.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for joining us today and talking about how courts and how attorneys determine values of assets and the impact that that can have on a divorce case. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
It's not just about what your assets are worth, it's about how the wording in your divorce decides who keeps what. One overlooked sentence could cost you tens of thousands of dollars. Here's the clause that keeps biting people long after the ink is dry.